Right. So in the first part, I told you about the context and the methods that we use, the different kinds of methodologies and data that we put together. And here I'm going to show you a few examples of preliminary results. The first one is leaves as fodder, the use of leaves to feed animals in the Viking Age. The second one focuses on Angelica archangelica, a plant that had a very prominent role in Nordic culture but has been mostly forgotten nowadays. And then at the end, I want to tell you about some results on the permanence or change of plant traditions over time. Because of course, when we try to infer ancestral states and infer what the Vikings used from modern data, this has an assumption that plant traditions don't change over time, right? So we will look at this question and see if it's to what extent it's true. The first example, so leaves as fodder. This is a little study that Carolina did, and she mixed archaeological finds, these scatters, these tools, with some text from one of the sagas, and then she used experimental data. She did basically an experiment on her farm on feeding animals leaves. After she did that, actually there was some archaeological evidence of leaves used as fodder in a Viking medieval site. So in this saga, there's a paragraph that says, "Lonely am I as the forest aspen, of kindred bear as the fear of its boughs. My joys are all lost as the leaves of the tree when the scattered twigs from the warm day turns." So warm day, summer, leaves are being harvested with a tool for some particular purpose. And then these tools have actually been found in excavations. The traditional knowledge says that leaves of Populus and Sordus, as well as other genera, have been used as fodder, and Caroline also harvested this to feed her animals in her farm in Norway. And then there's some evidence that this was also used. We can pin down a bit more in detail what species. The second example is the story of Angelica archangelica, this umbellifera. It's a rather high plant, about 1.5 meters, one of the very only aromatic species in the Nordic region. So very strong smell, especially the root, traditionally used for multiple purposes, that grows all along the Norwegian coast, Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and later has been cultivated in Central Europe. What's interesting about this plant is that all the vernacular names in all Nordic languages have the same etymon, the same word root, as well as the Inuit word and the Sami word. So the Inuit word and the Sami word had come from the North Germanic languages. Some scholars, some botanists studied genetically the dispersal of this plant, and you see in this map that actually the pattern of dispersal is very much the same as we saw with the pattern of settlement of Nordic populations to Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. What was very interesting is that in this article, they explicitly say that they didn't take into account any plants that had any relation with human history to avoid the possibility of humans contributing to dispersal. And it's interesting that they forgot that Angelica has been a major crop in the Nordic areas, a crop that has been abandoned, and probably abandoned at the beginning of the 20th century, but that is still cultivated in gardens in the Faroe Islands and very much associated with farms in Iceland. So that's interesting. Angelica is mentioned in the saga, one of the very few plants mentioned there, and perhaps not unsurprisingly, in a specific area of Norway, there is a variety of Angelica that has been semi-domesticated and selected for higher content of sugar. So usually Gualda angelica, if you look at the graph here, would have a hollow stem, so no flesh in the stem, and this particular variety has a much more fuller stem, so higher carbohydrate content in total, as well as higher sugars proportionally. We know from Sami populations that angelica had been carried around and planted in the different settlements, because you know that Sami populations were transhuman, semi-nomadic, nomadic, and so they would move around the landscape and would take not only their animals but also their plants with them. And so there is relic populations across Sapmi, the Sami territory. So could this also be the case for broader dispersal to Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland, right? When we do ancestral state reconstruction, so taking the modern uses or pre-industrial uses of angelica and reconstruct what uses could have been ancestral or potentially Viking, we find that food, especially as a leaf vegetable and medicine, seem to show ancestral characteristics. So we cannot pin down exactly what medicinal uses it was used for, but there is strong evidence also from this quantitative analysis that the Vikings had used this plant. And it is still used in modern Norwegian culture, in the New Nordic cuisine. It's still part of many dishes, especially as a condiment because of its particular taste, yet it's mostly forgotten by the overall population. That's a bit of a pity, but maybe we'll manage to make it popular again. And then the final example of results that I wanted to show. So here we have this study that we're trying to get published where we compare Flora Norvegica, so 18th century ethnobotany, with Planter of Tradition, so early 20th century ethnobotany, 200 years in between the two books. And the question is how much of the knowledge that we find in the 18th century is still present in the 20th century. Of course, there had been major changes, demographic, political, social, in between these periods. So what do we find? We actually find that both books document about as much diversity. The two books have a different focus, obviously. So Flora Norvegica has more of like an economic focus. There's lots of animal food uses, for example, very important at the time, before more industrialized way of raising animals and feeding cattle was available. Whereas Planter of Tradition is very much influenced by folklore studies, and there is a bigger emphasis on symbolic uses, like sayings, phrases, beliefs, etc., that wouldn't be of interest to the writer of Flora Norvegica. But when we take, for example, food plants, we see that in Flora Norvegica, there's about 150 use reports, slightly more in Planter of Tradition, 216. Approximately the same number of taxa, 121, 142, but only a quarter of these taxa are the same. So huge amount of diversity is not the same, is not reported in both books. And that was quite surprising, honestly. The same is found with any other category of use. Medicine, we have the same proportion of botanical overlap, 24%, and it's less for all the other categories, right? In fuel, there is only one plant that is the same. So lots of change, probably also a lot of under-documentation, so very high diversity across the Nordic territory, the Norwegian territory, that is not collected by the two authors. Plant traditions change quickly over time. They are not very permanent. Yet, we find that 93 plants in total have at least one same use in the two books. So there are traditions that are maintained. And which ones are those, and why are they maintained where others change, with other medicinal plants change, for example? And here we use some cultural evolutionary theory from a book called How Traditions Live and Die, Olivier Morin, in 2011. And he argues that for traditions to be maintained over time, they have to be accessible. So the people have to get to know them easily, and they have to be attractive. So you have to want to continue doing X thing rather than change for something else. And it's very interesting because when we look at these 93 plants, we find that some plants that have uses maintained are very particular. So, for example, as I said before, there are very few plants in the Nordic region that are aromatic, and we see that these aromatic plants are used in both books. And for when we look at dyes, for example, at coloring cloth, the plant that is mentioned as a dye in both books is one of the only ones that dyes red. Because many plants dye brown or yellow, but in the Nordic areas there's one plant that dyes yet, and this one is in both books. So we see that that while much of the botanical knowledge changes very quickly, we still can find these very deep these traditions with very deep roots. Some final thoughts. What for all these studies of Viking plants? Why is it interesting? Personally, I think that I'm very much aware that we are driving about 1 million species to extinction. We're destroying natural habitat. We are driving plants to extinction a lot quicker than animals, for example, and that has to do to some extent with a lack of awareness of the importance of plants in our lives. Plants are going extinct to a point that species that would have been weeds are becoming endangered because our lifestyles have changed so much that, and our relationships with the landscape have changed so much that habitats that we would have co-created with these species are disappearing. And traditional botanical knowledge is this link that allows us to reconnect with plant diversity, to know about it, to use it in sustainable ways, to maintain some of this diversity. And that's very much what I wanted to say. You have the references that I've cited throughout the text here. I would like to thank all these people who have helped in one way or another to make the content of this presentation. And thank you. Get in touch. I really look forward to hear from you.